My stepson forgot his towel and walked out of the bathroom rock hard. Imagine a single moment unraveling everything you thought you knew about yourself. What happens when forbidden boundaries blur and a lonely heart is faced with a choice that could shatter everything? How do you confront emotions that shouldn't exist? Stick around, because this story is one you won't forget. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more captivating tales like this one, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. The sound of the shower running upstairs was one I was used to by now, but today it seemed to echo louder in the stillness of the house. My husband was, as always, out of town on business, leaving the house eerily quiet, except for the occasional sounds of footsteps or water. I was in the kitchen, absently stirring a cup of tea when the noise stopped. The abrupt silence snapped me out of my thoughts, and I glanced toward the ceiling. It was a lazy summer morning, and the windows were open to let in the fresh air. The smell of the grass, freshly mowed by the neighbor earlier, blended with the faint aroma of the pancakes I had made earlier. But as I stood there, I realized I was holding my breath. I shook my head, chiding myself for being so on edge. There was no reason for it. Then I heard the bathroom door creak open. Instinctively, my eyes flicked toward the staircase visible from the kitchen, and I froze. My stepson Daniel stepped out into the hallway, wearing nothing but a towel wrapped loosely around his waist. His hair dripped with water, dark strands clinging to his forehead. I averted my gaze quickly, focusing on the tea as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. But before I could settle my nerves, a gasp escaped me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the towel slip, just for a moment before he caught it. My heart raced, not because of what I had seen, or barely seen, but because of the unexpectedness of it all. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, and my grip on the teacup tightened. "Morning, Jessica," Daniel called casually, as if nothing had happened. His voice carried that light, teasing tone he often used with me, as though he enjoyed catching me off guard. I turned my head slightly, keeping my eyes firmly above his shoulders. "Good morning," I replied, praying that my voice didn't betray the strange mix of emotions bubbling inside me. "Pancakes are on the counter, if you're hungry." He grinned, adjusting the towel securely around his waist. "Thanks. I'll grab some in a bit." And with that, he disappeared into his room, leaving the door ajar. I exhaled sharply, realizing I had been holding my breath. Shaking my head, I took the teacup and sat down at the dining table. I could feel my pulse hammering in my chest, and it irritated me. "He's just a boy," I told myself firmly. Well, not a boy exactly. He was 20 now, taller than his father, with a confidence that came from his age and the fitness he'd clearly been working on in college. But that didn't matter. He was still my stepson, and I had no business letting my mind wander. Still, my thoughts betrayed me. I remembered when Daniel first came to live with us after his father and I married. He had been polite but reserved, a little awkward around me. It was only over time, as he got used to me being in his life, that he had relaxed and become more outgoing. Now, his casual demeanor and easy smile sometimes made me forget there was ever an awkward phase between us. I shook the thoughts from my head and got up to clean the already tidy kitchen, needing something to do with my hands. As I rinsed dishes, I kept replaying the moment in my mind, feeling equal parts guilt and something I didn't want to name. It was a long time before I heard his footsteps coming downstairs. When I turned, he was dressed in a plain t-shirt and shorts, his damp hair still a little unruly. "You made these pancakes?" he asked, grinning as he picked one up and popped a piece into his mouth. "Yes," I said, folding my arms across my chest. "And there's syrup on the table, so maybe try eating like a civilized person." He laughed, his eyes crinkling in amusement. "What's the fun in that?" He leaned against the counter, taking another bite and clearly enjoying my irritation. I rolled my eyes and turned back to the sink, hoping the tension I felt wasn't visible. As I worked, I couldn't help but notice how comfortable he was, how easy his presence felt. It was a stark contrast to my husband, who rarely smiled these days, let alone shared playful banter. "Hey," Daniel said after a moment, his tone softer. "Are you okay? You seem—" I stiffened, gripping the edge of the counter before forcing myself to relax. "I'm fine," I said quickly. "Why would you think I'm not?" He shrugged, setting down his empty plate. "I don't know. You just seem a little off." "Maybe I'm imagining it." He studied me for a moment before adding, "If Dad were around more, maybe you wouldn't look so tired all the time." His words struck a nerve. I turned to face him, determined to brush it off. "I'm fine, Daniel, really. Don't worry about me." "I'm that." He nodded, but his expression didn't change. "If you say so." The conversation lingered in the air as he walked out of the kitchen, leaving me feeling more exposed than I cared to admit. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself. Whatever was happening inside me, I needed to stop it before it went any further. I couldn't allow myself to think about Daniel in any way that crossed the invisible line I had always drawn. He was my stepson, and that was all he could ever be. The whole thing collapsed into an immediate takedown, or at least, that was what I told myself. Later that afternoon, the house was quiet again. Daniel had gone out to meet some friends, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I tried to keep myself busy, folding laundry and organizing the living room, but my mind kept circling back to our earlier interaction. His casual comment about his father had hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just Daniel who noticed how absent my husband had become. Business trips, late-night calls, and the constant stream of emails seemed to take up every bit of his attention. Even when he was home, he was more likely to be glued to his laptop than talking to me. It wasn't that he was unkind, but it felt like I had been sidelined and our marriage, reduced to a quiet figure in the background of his life. I sighed, setting the laundry basket down and staring out the window. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting patterns on the floor. I had always loved this house with its big windows and cozy corners, but lately it felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a text from my husband. "Running late again? Don't wait up for me." I clenched my jaw, trying to push down the wave of frustration that bubbled up. I typed a quick reply. "Okay, be safe," and set the phone down harder than I intended. The small thud it made felt unsatisfying, like trying to stomp on a cloud. I decided to take my mind off things by stepping out into the garden. The backyard was my favorite place to escape when I needed space to think. I spent the next hour weeding flower beds and trimming the bushes, losing myself in the rhythmic movements. The sun was warm on my back, and the familiar scent of lavender from the far corner of the yard was soothing. By the time I was done, I felt calmer, though no closer to resolving the uneasy feelings lingering in my chest. As I wiped my hands on my jeans and turned to head back inside, I heard the sound of the front door opening and closing. Daniel's voice carried into the backyard as he called out, "Hey, I'm back." "No," I stepped into the kitchen, catching sight of him as he placed his keys on the counter. He was carrying a grocery bag, and his hair was slightly damp, as though he'd just washed up after his outing. "Hey," I greeted, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "What's in the bag?" "Snacks," he said, holding it up with a grin. "A few of us are heading to the lake tomorrow, so I figured I'd stock up." "These sounds nice," I replied, smiling faintly. "The weather's supposed to be perfect." "Yeah, it'll be fun," he said, setting the bag down. His gaze lingered on me for a moment, and I noticed the faint crease in his brow. "You've been out here all day, haven't you?" I nodded, unconvinced. "I needed the distraction," I admitted, leaning against the counter. "Your dad's running late again." Daniel's expression darkened, and he let out a short laugh. "What a shocker." "Daniel," I started, a warning in my tone. "No, seriously," he said, shaking his head. "It's like he doesn't even care that you're here. If I had someone like you waiting for me at home, I wouldn't waste a second ignoring her." I froze, his words hitting me harder than I expected. There was a sincerity in his voice that made my stomach twist uncomfortably. "That's not fair," I said finally, though my voice sounded weaker than I intended. "Isn't it?" he shot back, his eyes meeting mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the tension between us thick enough to cut. Then, as if realizing he'd crossed a line, Daniel took a step back and ran a hand through his hair. "Sorry. I didn't mean to. I just hate seeing you like this." I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself. "It's okay. I know you're just trying to help." "Yeah," he said softly, his gaze dropping to the floor. After a moment, he grabbed the grocery bag and turned toward the stairs. "I'm gonna put these away. Let me know if you need anything." I nodded, watching him disappear down the hallway. The air in the room felt heavy, and I sank into a chair at the table, rubbing my temples. This was exactly what I had been trying to avoid: blurred lines, unspoken feelings, and moments that felt too intimate to be innocent. The rest of the evening passed in relative silence. Daniel stayed in his room, and I tried to focus on a book I had been meaning to finish for weeks, but the words blurred together on the page. When I finally went to bed, the house was dark and quiet, but my thoughts refused to settle. The next morning, I found Daniel in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He looked up when I walked in, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, forcing a small smile as I reached for my own mug. There was an awkwardness between us now, an unspoken acknowledgement of yesterday's conversation. I wanted to say something to ease the tension, but I didn't know where to start. "Sitting up?" "So, the lake trip," I said finally, trying to sound casual. "What time are you heading out?" "Late morning," he said, leaning against the counter. "We'll probably stay most of the day." "Good. You should enjoy yourself," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee. "What about you?" he asked, his voice softer. "What do you do for fun these days?" I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know," I admitted with a faint shrug. "It's been a while since I've thought about that." "You should figure it out," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "You deserve more than just this." He gestured vaguely to the empty kitchen, the quiet house. I swallowed hard, his words cutting deeper than he probably realized. "Maybe," I said, not trusting myself to say more. "Until." He nodded, taking his coffee and heading toward the living room. As he walked away, I couldn't help but feel the growing distance between the life I was living and the life I wanted. Later that day, Daniel had left for his trip to the lake, leaving the house quiet once more. I welcomed the silence, using it to organize the pantry and sort through the growing pile of mail on the counter. Yet, no matter how focused I tried to be, my thoughts kept returning to his words from that morning. You deserve more than just this. I shook my head, trying to brush it off, but it was like an itch I couldn't reach. He had no idea what he was talking about. How could he? He was young, barely stepping into the world as an adult. What did he know about marriage, about the sacrifices people made? And yet, his words stayed with me, stirring something I wasn't ready to confront. The door slammed shut later that evening, startling me. "I'm back," Daniel called, his voice carrying through the house. I poked my head out of the kitchen to find him standing in the entryway, his hair damp and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He smiled when he saw me, his expression easy and relaxed. "Did you miss me?" he teased. I rolled my eyes. "Of course. The house was so boring without you." He laughed, dropping the bag onto the floor and running a hand through his hair. "The lake was great, but I think I got a little too much sun." He tugged at his shirt, revealing the faint pink hue on his arms and neck. I frowned. "Did you put on sunscreen?" He shrugged, grinning sheepishly. "Sort of." "Well, that's helpful," I said, grabbing some aloe vera from the cabinet. "Come here. You're going to regret it tomorrow if you don't take care of that now." Daniel stepped closer, and I squeezed a generous amount of the gel into my hands. He winced as I gently applied it to his shoulders, his skin warm under my fingers. "You know, you're way too nice to me," he said, his voice low. "Someone has to take care of you," I replied lightly, though my heart beat faster at the proximity. I focused on the task, trying not to let my mind wander. When I finished, he caught my hand before I could step away. "Thanks," he said, his grip lingering just a moment too long. "You're welcome," I said quickly, pulling my hand back and stepping away. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. "You should drink some water. Dehydration will only make it worse." "Got it, Mom," he said, smirking as he grabbed a glass from the cabinet. I stiffened at the word, though I knew he didn't mean anything by it. It was a stark reminder of the line I was so desperately trying not to cross. "Good night, Daniel," I said, my voice clipped. "Good night," he replied, his tone softer. His eyes lingered on me as I walked out of the kitchen. The next morning I woke early, determined to start fresh and put the strange tension of the past few days behind me. I was halfway through my coffee when Daniel appeared, still in his pajamas, his hair sticking up in every direction. He yawned as he poured himself a cup, glancing at me with a lazy smile. "Morning," he mumbled, leaning against the counter. "Morning," I replied, feeling a strange mix of comfort and unease at the casualness of the moment. "Any plans today?" he asked, sipping his coffee. "Just the usual," I said, shrugging. "Laundry, cleaning, maybe some gardening if the weather holds." "Sounds exciting," he teased, his eyes sparkling with mischief. I rolled my eyes. "Not all of us get to spend the day lounging by the lake." "Fair enough," he said, grinning. "If you need help with anything, just let me know." He gave me a hug. "Thanks, but I think I can manage," I said, turning back to my mug. Later that afternoon, while I was trimming the hedges in the backyard, I heard the door open and turned to see Daniel stepping out onto the porch. He was shirtless, a towel slung over his shoulder, and a bottle of water in his hand. "Do you ever take a break?" he asked, leaning against the railing. "Not really," I replied, trying to focus on the hedge and not the way the sunlight caught the lines of his shoulders. "Well, you should," he said, walking over to me. "Here." He handed me the bottle of water, his fingers brushing mine. I jerked. Thanks, I said, taking a long sip. He watched me for a moment before plopping down onto the grass. You know, you could make a fortune running this place like a spa. It's so peaceful back here. I laughed, shaking my head. That's one way to look at it. I'm serious, he said, smiling up at me. It's like your little slice of paradise. Paradise is a bit of a stretch, I said, leaning on the hedge trimmer. But it's nice. We fell into an easy silence, the kind that felt rare these days. For a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down, leaving just the two of us in the golden afternoon light. You should do something for yourself, he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I frowned. What do you mean? I mean, you spend all your time taking care of everyone else, he said, his gaze serious. When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to? I opened my mouth to reply, but nothing came out. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. I'm fine, I said finally, my voice weaker than I intended. You don't have to pretend with me, he said, his eyes searching mine. I turned away, focusing on the hedge trimmer in my hands. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do, he said softly. His words stayed with me long after he went back inside, following me like a shadow as I finished my work. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between us. Let me know if you're ready for the next 1,000 words or if there's anything you'd like adjusted. The next evening, the house was quiet again. My husband was still away on business, and Daniel had gone out to the gym after dinner. I tried to busy myself with tidying up the living room, folding the throw blankets and fluffing the cushions, but my mind was restless. When I heard the front door open, my heart jumped. I'm back, Daniel called, his voice carrying through the house. In here, I replied, trying to sound casual. He walked into the living room, a towel slung around his neck, his gym bag in one hand. He was still wearing his workout clothes, his t-shirt damp with sweat and clinging to his skin. The gym was packed, he said, dropping the bag by the door. Everyone must have had the same idea to work out after dinner. Sounds about right, I said, looking up at him briefly before averting my eyes. Do you want something to drink? Sure, he said, following me into the kitchen. Water would be great. I grabbed a glass and filled it at the sink, handing it to him as he leaned against the counter. He drank deeply, his Adam's apple bobbing with each swallow. I tried not to stare, focusing instead on the small pile of mail on the counter. You know, he said after a moment, setting the glass down. You've been acting different lately. I froze, my hand hovering over the envelopes. What do you mean? I don't know, he said, shrugging. You just seem tense, like something's bothering you. I'm fine, I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. Why does everyone keep asking me that? Maybe because we care about you, he said, his tone light but his expression serious. It's okay to admit when something's wrong, you know? I busied myself with sorting through the mail, my fingers trembling slightly. I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine, really. Daniel didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes on me. The weight of his gaze was almost unbearable, like he could see straight through me. Finally, he sighed and pushed off the counter. All right, he said, his tone neutral. If you say so. He left the kitchen, and I exhaled, my shoulders slumping with relief. But the reprieve was short-lived. A few minutes later, I heard him call out from the living room. Hey, do you want to watch a movie? I hesitated, debating whether to decline and retreat to the safety of my bedroom. but the thought of sitting alone in the quiet, overthinking everything, was just as unappealing. "Sure," I said finally, walking into the living room. Daniel was already on the couch, scrolling through streaming options on the TV. He glanced up as I entered, patting the cushion next to him. "Come on, I found something you'll like." I sat down, keeping a careful distance between us. The movie started, and for a while I let myself get lost in the story, grateful for the distraction. But as the movie went on, I became acutely aware of Daniel's presence next to me, his arm resting on the back of the couch, his leg brushing mine when he shifted. At one point, I reached for the bowl of popcorn between us, and our hands collided. "Sorry," I said, pulling back quickly. "It's fine," he said, his voice soft. His hand lingered for a moment before he picked up a handful of popcorn. "You're jumpy tonight." "I'm not jumpy," I said, my tone defensive. "You sure?" he asked, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Because you've been acting like I'm gonna bite or something." "Don't be ridiculous," I said, trying to sound stern, but the warmth in my cheeks betrayed me. Daniel chuckled, his gaze returning to the screen, but after a moment he spoke again, his tone more serious. "You don't have to put on a brave face all the time, you know. It's okay to let people in." I stiffened, the words hitting too close to home. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," he said, turning to face me. "You don't have to do this alone." "Daniel," I started, my voice faltering. "This isn't..." "It's not what?" he pressed, leaning closer. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The air between us felt electric, charged with something neither of us could name. "This is inappropriate," I said finally, standing up abruptly. "I think it's time for me to go to bed." He didn't stop me, but I could feel his eyes on my back as I left the room. My heart was pounding as I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. By the time I reached my bedroom, my hands were trembling, and I closed the door with a shaky exhale. The next morning, I avoided Daniel as much as possible. I kept myself busy in the garden, pulling weeds and trimming the hedges, anything to keep my hands occupied and my mind distracted. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of the previous night, the intensity of his gaze, the warmth of his voice, the way my heart had raced when he leaned closer. By the time the sun began to set, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I was about to head inside when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Daniel standing at the edge of the yard, his hands in his pockets. "Hey," he said, his voice hesitant. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, glancing toward the house. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Please," he said, taking a step closer. I don't want things to be weird between us." "They're not weird," I said quickly, though the words felt hollow. "Come on, Jessica," he said, his tone soft but firm. "You can't tell me you don't feel it." "Feel what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This," he said, gesturing between us. "The way things have changed. The way we, I don't know, connect. It's different now, isn't it?" I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. "Daniel, this is inappropriate." "Why?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Because it's complicated? Because it doesn't fit into some perfect little box? Because it's wrong," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "It doesn't feel wrong to me." "It is," I said, taking a step back. "You're my stepson. I'm married to your father. This Whatever you think this is, it can't happen. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. I just want you to be happy, he said quietly. And I don't think he's doing that. His words cut deep, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. This isn't about him, I said, my voice trembling. It's about doing what's right. Is it? He asked, his tone challenging. Or is it about being afraid? I didn't answer, turning away instead. I can't do this, Daniel, I said, my voice barely audible. Please, just let it go. Let me know if you're ready for the next 1,000 words or if there's anything you'd like adjusted. The following days were marked by an unbearable tension in the house. Daniel had withdrawn, barely speaking to me except for polite, perfunctory exchanges. His usual teasing and playful demeanor had been replaced with quiet, measured politeness, and it unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I told myself that this was for the best, that some distance between us would help me sort through the mess of emotions swirling inside me. But the distance didn't provide the relief I had hoped for. Instead, it magnified my loneliness. My husband's absence loomed larger than ever, and the realization that the warm, easy connection I'd shared with Daniel was now fractured gnawed at me relentlessly. One evening, I decided to make an effort to bring some normalcy back into the house. I prepared a big dinner, something I hadn't done in weeks, and called Daniel down. He appeared in the doorway of the dining room, his expression neutral as he took in the spread on the table. Wow, he said, sitting down slowly. What's the occasion? No occasion, I said, forcing a smile. I just thought it'd be nice to have a proper meal together. He nodded, but his face betrayed no emotion. Looks great. Thanks. We ate mostly in silence, the clinking of silverware against plates the only sound. I searched for a way to break the ice, but everything I thought of felt either too forced or too risky. It wasn't until Daniel finally spoke that the quiet tension broke. Do you ever get tired of this? He asked, gesturing vaguely to the room around us. Tired of what? I asked, cautiously. This life, he said, his voice low. The empty house, the constant waiting. Doesn't it ever feel like, I don't know, like you're stuck? His words hit like a physical blow, cutting through the fragile veneer of normalcy I'd tried to maintain. I set down my fork, my appetite gone. What are you trying to say, Daniel? He sighed, leaning back in his chair. Nothing. Forget it. No, I said, my voice firmer than I intended. You brought it up. Say what you mean. His eyes met mine, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. I don't understand how you do it, he said quietly. How you stay here, day after day, with nothing to look forward to. I have a lot to look forward to, I said defensively, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they rang hollow. Do you? He asked, his gaze unwavering. Because it doesn't seem like it. That's enough, I said sharply, standing up and gathering the plates. I don't need you analyzing my life. I'm not trying to upset you, he said, his tone softening. I hate seeing you like this. You deserve more. I froze, the plates trembling slightly in my hands. What I deserve isn't your concern, I said finally, turning toward the kitchen. Just leave it alone, Daniel. But as I walked away, I felt his words sink deeper, wrapping around my thoughts and refusing to let go. The next morning, I woke to find a note on the kitchen counter. Gone for the day. Don't wait up. Daniel's handwriting was neat and deliberate, and though the message was brief, it left me feeling a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. The house was too quiet without him, and I found myself wandering aimlessly from room to room, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. I told myself that it was a good thing, that I needed the space to clear my head. But as the hours dragged on, I couldn't ignore the gnawing ache of loneliness that had become my constant companion. By the time evening rolled around, I was desperate for some kind of distraction. I decided to watch a movie, hoping it would take my mind off things. But just as I settled onto the couch, I heard the front door open. Daniel stepped inside, his expression unreadable as he set his keys on the table. "Hey," he said, his voice even. "Hey," I replied, my tone cautious. He stood in the doorway for a moment before walking into the living room. "What are you watching?" "Nothing yet," I said, gesturing to the blank screen. I couldn't decide. He nodded, sitting down on the opposite end of the couch. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course not," I said, though my heart was already racing. We settled into an uneasy silence as the movie began, the space between us feeling both too wide and too narrow. As the minutes tipped by, I became acutely aware of every movement he made, the way his arm rested on the back of the couch, the way his leg brushed mine when he shifted slightly. Halfway through the movie he spoke, his voice low. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what I said yesterday." I glanced at him, my pulse quickening. "Daniel, I don't think this is the time." "Just hear me out," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "I know I've been pushing, and maybe that's unfair, but I can't just ignore this anymore." "Ignore what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "The way I feel about you." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't speak. "Daniel," I said finally, my voice trembling, "you can't. This isn't right." "Why not?" he asked, his tone challenging. "Because of Dad? Because of some rule we're supposed to follow?" "None of that changes the way I feel." "This isn't about rules," I said, standing up abruptly. "It's about doing the right thing. And this isn't it." He stood as well, closing the distance between us in a single step. "So you're just gonna pretend like you don't feel it too? Like there's nothing between us?" "There can't be," I said, my voice breaking. "Do you understand that? There can't be anything between us." His expression softened, and he reached out as if to touch my arm but stopped short. "I just want you to be happy," he said quietly. "That's all I've ever wanted." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, and I shook my head. "You don't understand, Daniel. This isn't about happiness. It's about consequences." "Clem, maybe it's time you stopped worrying about the consequences," he said softly, "and started thinking about what you really want." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there, his words echoing in my mind long after I'd closed the door behind me. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and unspoken tension. Daniel seemed to take my retreat as a signal to give me space, though his silence only made the weight of our last conversation hang heavier in the air. I went through the motions of my daily routines, but everything felt off, like the house itself had shifted under the strain of our unacknowledged feelings. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or disappointed when Daniel left early one morning without a word. The note he left on the kitchen counter was brief. "Be back late. Don't wait up." It was the same message he'd left before, but this time it felt different. final, almost, as if he was telling me he needed distance just as much as I did. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, nursing a glass of wine and staring blankly at the TV. The sound of the program barely registered as my thoughts spiraled. I thought about my marriage, the years of compromise and quiet discontent. I thought about Daniel, the way his words had cut through my defenses and forced me to confront truths I'd spent so long ignoring. When the front door finally opened, I jumped, my heart racing as Daniel stepped inside. He looked tired, his hair slightly disheveled and his shoulders slumped. He hesitated when he saw me, as if debating whether to say anything. Finally, he nodded toward my glass. "Rough day?" I shrugged, offering a faint smile. "Something like that." He crossed the room and sat down on the opposite end of the couch, his presence filling the space in a way that made it hard to breathe. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence crackled, heavy with everything we weren't saying. "I think we need to talk," he said finally, his voice low. "I don't think that's a good idea," I replied, gripping my glass tighter. "Maybe not," he said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, "but I can't keep pretending like this is normal, like nothing's happened." "Nothing has happened," I said sharply, though my voice trembled. "And it can't, Daniel. Don't you understand that?" "I understand a lot more than you think," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "I understand that you're unhappy, that you deserve more than the life you've been settling for." "Stop it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" he asked, his tone challenging. "You think I don't see it? The way he treats you like an afterthought? The way you light up when you're not around him? You don't have to pretend with me, Jessica." His words cut deep, forcing me to confront feelings I'd spent years suppressing. "This isn't about him," I said, setting the glass down with trembling hands. "This is about us. And there can't be an us, Daniel. It's not right." "Who decides what's right?" he asked, standing and pacing the room. "Society? Some rule book about families? 'Cause none of that changes how I feel." "You don't mean that," I said desperately, standing to face him. "You're young, you're confused, you're looking for something, and you've latched on to me because I'm here. But this isn't real. And so you can't come." And I scooted back from the stool. "It's real to me," he said, his voice rising. "And I think it's real to you too, no matter how much you want to deny it." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. My chest felt tight, my thoughts spinning as I searched for something, anything, that would make him understand. But before I could speak, he stepped closer, his eyes intense. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice a quiet challenge. "Look me in the eye and tell me I'm wrong." I froze, the weight of his words pinning me in place. I wanted to deny it, to say the words that would end this once and for all. But I couldn't. The truth was too raw, too close to the surface, and the intensity of his gaze left me feeling exposed in a way I wasn't prepared for. When I didn't respond, his expression softened. "Jessica," he said quietly, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite name. "Hope, maybe? Or desperation? You don't have to keep pretending. Not with me." I took a shaky step back, shaking my head. "This has to stop," I said, my voice barely audible. "Whatever you think this is, it has to end. I can't do this." "You can or you won't?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Does it matter?" I shot back, my voice rising. "The answer is the same. This can't happen, Daniel. And the sooner you accept that, the better." His jaw tightened and he looked away, his shoulders tense. Fine, he said after a long moment, if that's what you want. It's not about what I want, I said, though the words felt hollow. It's about what's right. He didn't respond, and the silence that followed was deafening. Finally, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, trembling and more conflicted than ever. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the front door closing. I hurried downstairs, hoping to catch Daniel before he left, but he was already gone. The note he left on the kitchen counter was short and to the point, taking some time to clear my head. Don't worry about me. The words sent a pang through my chest, and I sank into a chair, the note crumpling in my hand. I told myself this was a good thing, that we both needed the space to sort through our emotions. But as the hours stretched into days, the quiet house felt more oppressive than ever. When Daniel finally returned, it was late in the evening and I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, and my heart raced as he appeared in the doorway. "Hey," he said, his voice cautious. "I'm back." "I see that," I said, setting a plate down and wiping my hands on a towel. "Are you okay?" Erie said, leaning against the doorframe. "I just needed some time to think." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The air between us was thick with tension, and I could feel his eyes on me as I busied myself with the dishes. "Where are you going?" "Can we talk?" he asked after a moment. "I don't think there's anything left to say," I said quietly, though my voice wavered. "I think there's a lot left to say," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "But I'll make it simple. I'm not giving up on you, Jessica." His words stopped me in my tracks, and I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "Daniel." "And no," he said, cutting me off. "You've had your chance to say what you think is right. Now it's my turn. I love you, Jessica, and I'm not going to pretend like I don't." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. "You can't say things like that," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not fair." "Fair?" he said, his tone incredulous. "What's fair about any of this? What's fair about watching someone you care about settle for less than they deserve?" "You don't understand," I said, shaking my head. "You don't know what you're asking of me." "I'm asking you to be honest," he said, his voice softening. "With me. With yourself. That's all." I looked away, my hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. "This can't happen," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe not," he said, his tone resigned. "But that doesn't change how I feel." I didn't respond, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the weight of everything we'd left unsaid. The days following Daniel's confession were marked by a strange and oppressive quiet. He didn't avoid me, but he didn't seek me out either. Our interactions were limited to polite exchanges. "Good morning. Dinner's ready. Do you need help with that?" All spoken in tones that felt hollow and careful, like we were tiptoeing around a fragile glass sculpture neither of us wanted to shatter. I tried to distract myself with work around the house. Every room became a project, reorganizing the pantry, deep cleaning the bathrooms, even tackling the attic, which I had avoided for years. But no matter how hard I scrubbed or how many boxes I sorted, I couldn't shake the lingering weight of Daniel's words. "I love you, Jessica." The memory replayed in my mind constantly. His voice soft but resolute, his eyes locked on mine with a vulnerability that left me breathless. He hadn't demanded anything from me, hadn't pushed or pressured. He had simply spoken his truth, leaving the choice of how to respond entirely in my hands. It was a weight I wasn't sure I could bear. One evening, I sat in the backyard, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting the garden in a soft golden light. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of lavender from the far corner of the yard. I cradled a glass of wine in my hands, staring out at the flower beds I had meticulously tended over the years. They were blooming beautifully, vibrant and full of life, but somehow they only made the emptiness inside me feel more pronounced. I heard the back door open and glanced over my shoulder to see Daniel stepping outside. He hesitated when he saw me, his expression unreadable. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice careful. "Of course not," I said, gesturing to the chair beside me. He sat down slowly, leaning back and gazing out at the garden. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable, like we were both gathering the courage to say something, but unsure of how to begin. "I missed this place while I was away," he said finally, his voice low. "It always feels so peaceful here." "It's my favorite spot," I admitted, swirling the wine in my glass. "It's where I come when I need to think." "Do you do that a lot?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Think?" "Lately, more than I'd like to," I said, glancing at him. "You?" "All the time," he said, his tone soft. "Especially about you." His words hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten. I set my glass down carefully, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Daniel, I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" he asked, turning to face me. "This," I said, gesturing between us. "Whatever this is, I don't know how to handle it." "You don't have to handle it," he said, his gaze steady. "You just have to feel it." "That's not how life works," I said, shaking my head. "There are rules, boundaries, consequences." "Maybe," he said, leaning forward slightly. "But what about happiness? Doesn't that matter too?" I looked away, my throat tightening. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," he said softly. "Maybe you've just been taught to think it isn't." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I picked up my glass and took a long sip, the wine burning slightly as it slid down my throat. The silence stretched between us, but this time it felt heavier, weighted with all the things we weren't saying. The next morning, I woke to find the house empty again. Daniel's note was on the counter as usual, but this one was different. "I'll be gone all day. Don't worry. I'll be back tonight. We should talk." The words filled me with equal parts dread and anticipation. I spent the day trying to prepare myself for whatever conversation awaited us, but no amount of planning could quiet the storm of emotions inside me. I was torn between the safety of the life I had built and the pull of something I couldn't name but couldn't deny. By the time Daniel returned that evening, I was sitting in the living room waiting. He stepped inside, his expression guarded as he set his keys on the table and glanced at me. Hey, I said, my voice soft. "Did you have a good day?" "It was okay," he said, sitting down on the opposite end of the couch. "How about you?" "Uneventful," I said with a faint smile. "I've been thinking a lot." "About what?" he asked, his tone careful. I hesitated, my hand twisting in my lap. "About us. About what you said." His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was quiet but steady. And? Why? I don't know, I admitted, my voice trembling. I don't know what to do. You don't have to have all the answers, he said gently. But you can't keep running from this, Jessica. It's not going to go away. I know, I said, my eyes filling with tears. But I'm scared, Daniel. I'm scared of what this means, of what could happen if we... Then let me take some of that fear away, he said, leaning closer. Let me show you that this doesn't have to be a bad thing. I looked at him, my heart pounding as his words wrapped around me. The room felt smaller, the air charged with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like to let go, to give in to the feelings I'd tried so hard to suppress. But then reality came crashing back and I shook my head. I can't, I said, my voice breaking. I can't do this, Daniel. Why not? He asked, his tone desperate. Because of him? Because of some rule book about what's right and wrong? 'Cause I can't live with the consequences, I said, standing abruptly. I can't be the person who ruins everything. You wouldn't be, he said, standing as well. You'd be the person who finally chose herself, who finally stopped settling for less. His words struck a nerve, and I felt anger rise in my chest. You think it's that simple? I asked, my voice shaking. You think I can just throw away everything I've built, everything I've worked for, because of how I feel? Yes, he said, his voice firm, because if you don't, you're going to spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been. And you deserve more than that, Jessica. Tears spilled down my cheeks and I turned away, unable to look at him. I need time, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Take all the time you need, he said, his tone softening. I'm not going anywhere. The days that followed were a strange mix of clarity and confusion. I threw myself into projects around the house, trying to keep my mind occupied, but no matter what I did, Daniel's words lingered in the back of my mind. The life I had built felt more fragile than ever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at a crossroads, with no idea which path to take. One afternoon, I found myself in the garden again, the sun warm on my back as I tended to the flower beds. The sound of footsteps behind me made me pause, and I turned to see Daniel, standing at the edge of the yard, his expression unreadable. His face was pale. Hey, he said, his voice hesitant. I thought I might find you here. It's my favorite spot, I said with a faint smile. It helps me think. Have you figured anything out? He asked, stepping closer. Not yet, I admitted, wiping my hands on my jeans. But I'm trying. That's all I can ask for, he said softly. We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of our unspoken emotions hanging in the air. Finally, he reached out, his hand brushing mine briefly before pulling back. I just want you to be happy, Jessica. That's all I've ever wanted. She bit her lip as she considered his words. I know, I said, my voice trembling, but sometimes I don't even know what that means. Then maybe it's time to find out, he said, his gaze steady. And I'll be here, no matter what you decide. His words stayed with me long after he walked away, leaving me alone in the garden with nothing but the flowers and my thoughts. The weight of Daniel's words lingered long after he'd left me in the garden. I just want you to be happy, Jessica. That's all I've ever wanted. I spent the next few days in a haze, lost in my own thoughts as I moved through the house. The walls that once felt comforting now seemed to close in around me. Every familiar detail, the chipped paint on the baseboards, the creak of the stairs, felt like a reminder of the life I had built and the cracks that were beginning to show. One afternoon, I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at an old photo album I'd pulled from the attic. The pictures told the story of a life that seemed so far removed from where I was now. Vacations to the beach, family gatherings during the holidays, the early years of my marriage when everything felt hopeful and full of promise. But as I flipped through the pages, the smiling faces began to feel like strangers. My husband's arm around my shoulders, his easy grin. It was a version of him I hadn't seen in years, and the woman standing beside him, glowing with happiness, felt like a ghost of who I used to be. The sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand pulled me from my thoughts. I glanced at the screen to see a text from my best friend, Claire. Dinner this week. I miss your face. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, too exhausted to muster the energy for a social visit. But then I thought of Claire's no-nonsense advice and her knack for cutting through my self-pity with brutal honesty. If anyone could help me make sense of this mess, it was her. A few days later, I found myself sitting across from Claire in a cozy corner of our favorite cafe. She sipped her iced coffee, her sharp eyes studying me as I picked at the edge of my napkin. "All right," she said finally, setting her cup down with a thunk. "Spill. What's going on? You've got that look." "What look?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "The look you get when something's eating you alive but you're too stubborn to admit it," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Come on, Jess, out with it." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "It's complicated." "Isn't it always?" she said dryly. "Give me the short version." I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I feel stuck," I said finally. "Like my life is this big, empty routine, and I'm just going through the motions." Claire nodded slowly, her expression softening. "That's not exactly a new revelation. You've been feeling like that for a while now." "This is different," I said, my voice dropping. "It's not just about the marriage anymore. It's someone else." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "Go on." I took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "It's Daniel, my stepson. I don't know how it happened, but there's something between us, and it's tearing me apart." Claire's eyebrows shot up, but she quickly composed herself. "Okay," she said carefully. "That's a lot." You think I don't know that?" I said, my voice rising. "I didn't ask for this, Clara. I didn't want any of this, but it's there and I don't know what to do." She leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "Jess, you need to stop beating yourself up. Feelings happen. You can't control that. What you can control is what you do about them." "That's the problem," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know what the right thing is anymore. Do I just bury this and pretend it never happened? Do I keep living this half-life, pretending everything is fine?" Claire reached across the table, her hand covering mine. "You deserve to be happy, Jess. But you need to figure out what that looks like for you. Not for Daniel, not for your husband, for you." I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. "What if I make the wrong choice?" "You will," she said bluntly. "Everyone does. But the wrong choice for the right reasons is better than staying stuck forever." When I got home that evening, the house was dark and quiet. Daniel's car was in the driveway, but he wasn't in the living room or the kitchen. I found him in his room, sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. "Daniel," I said softly, stepping into the room. He looked up, his expression weary. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, sitting down beside him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I feel like I'm losing my mind, Jess. I don't know how to do this anymore." His vulnerability was like a punch to the gut, and I felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over me. "I know how you feel," I said quietly. "This hasn't been easy for me either." He turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "Then what are we doing? Are we just going to keep pretending like this isn't happening?" "I don't have the answers, Daniel," I said, my voice trembling. "All I know is that I'm scared. I'm scared of what this means, of what it could cost us." "I'm scared too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the thought of losing you, I can't handle that." Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I shook my head. "You're not going to lose me. But we have to figure out how to move forward without destroying everything." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I'll do whatever it takes, Jess. Just tell me what you need." "I need time," I said, my voice breaking. "And I need you to be patient with me." "You have all the time you need," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "I'm not going anywhere." Over the next few days, I tried to take Claire's advice to heart. I spent hours journaling, trying to untangle the mess of emotions that had consumed me. I thought about my marriage, about the life I had built with my husband, and the ways it had slowly unraveled over the years. I thought about Daniel, about the warmth and connection I felt with him that I hadn't realized I was missing until it was right in front of me. But most of all, I thought about myself, about the woman I had become and the woman I wanted to be. Somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of what made me happy, of what made me feel alive, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to wonder if it was possible to find that again. One evening, I found Daniel in the garden, sitting on the stone bench beneath the lavender bushes. The sun was setting, casting the yard in a warm, golden glow. He looked up as I approached, his expression cautious. "Hey," I said, sitting down beside him. "Hey," he replied, his voice quiet. We sat in silence for a moment, the scent of lavender heavy in the air. Finally, I spoke. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." "Ah, yeah?" he asked, his gaze steady. "I don't have all the answers yet," I said, my voice trembling. "But I know one thing for sure. I can't keep living like this. I need to figure out what makes me happy, and I need to do it for myself." Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand. And that might mean making some hard choices," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "Choices that might hurt both of us." "I'll be okay," he said, his voice soft but steady. "As long as you're okay." I turned to him, my heart aching. "I don't want to lose you, Daniel, but I need to find myself again." "You won't lose me," he said, reaching out to brush a tear from my cheek. "I'll always be here, no matter what." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. And the following morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt both soothing and ominous. I had spent much of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment, every conversation, every decision that had brought me to this point. The weight of it all felt suffocating, but there was a strange clarity in the chaos. I knew that I couldn't go on as I had been, that something had to give, even if it meant unraveling everything I thought I had built. Daniel was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sipping coffee and staring out the window. He turned when he heard me, his expression cautious. "Good morning." "Morning," I replied, pouring myself a cup and joining him at the table. For a long moment we sat in silence, the tension between us palpable. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "Have you decided?" I looked down at my hands, my fingers wrapped tightly around the mug. "Not completely," I admitted. "But I know that I need to take a step back from everything. I need time to figure out who I am and what I want." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I understand." "I'm not sure you do," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't just about us, Daniel. It's about everything. My marriage, my sense of self, my future. I can't make any decisions until I figure that out." "And where does that leave me?" he asked softly, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know," I said honestly, tears prickling the corners of my eyes. "But I need you to trust me, Daniel. I need you to give me the space to figure this out." He exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping. "I want to hate this," he said, his voice breaking. "I want to fight it, but I can't, Jessica. I can't fight you." Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine. "I care about you, Daniel, more than I should, but if we do this the wrong way, we'll destroy everything, including each other." His fingers tightened around mine, his grip both firm and tender. "I just want you to be happy," he said quietly, "even if that means letting you go." I closed my eyes, his words cutting deeper than I expected. "Thank you," I whispered, "for understanding." The rest of the day passed in a haze, the weight of our conversation hanging over me. That evening I watched from the doorway as Daniel packed a small bag and loaded it into his car. He glanced back at me one last time, his expression a mixture of sadness and quiet resolve. "Take care of yourself, Jess," he said softly. "You too," I replied, my voice barely audible. As his car disappeared down the street, I stood there for a long time, the stillness of the house settling around me. For the first time in years, I felt both completely lost and strangely free.